Octavianus, up until the age of 1819, really doesn't feature prominently in Roman history at all. The whole notion of him being an heir is really quite surprising. It's something that is effectively sort of presented during the course of when the will is read out during the funeral. And figures like Cicero and even Mark Antony are, struck at this, this because he's not also the only blood relative of Julius Caesar either. He has other nephews. So the idea that this particular child, effectively, who had only undergone his ceremony of attaining manhood a few years earlier, should suddenly inherit the name is rather remarkable. But
Mm.
so that is in itself remarkable. The fact that he inherited the legacy of Caesar, not the offices of dictator, not all the legions of Caesar either, none of the things that would allow him to take over power and begin ruling at the age of 19. But he inherits that legacy, and more critically, he decides to assume that legacy. It is a
Mm.
conscious decision that Augustus takes, that I am going to take my uncle's name and I am going to become Caesar. It is something no
Mm.
one
Mm.
expected him to do. Basically, everyone thought he was a boy who had this position, again, inherited by accident. He has very little allies. Mark Antony doesn't take him seriously. The former sort of optimates don't take him seriously, i.e., the elite ranks of the senatorial class. Cicero
Yes.
doesn't take him
Mm.
seriously.
Yeah.
Even his, well, what I found fascinating actually rereading this subject is that even his mother, Atia, encouraged him to not accept the legacy of Caesar because it would basically place a massive target on him.
Mm.
So that really is the context, that Julius Caesar and his legacy essentially could have died when the quote unquote liberators assassinated him. And then Cassius and Brutus could have consolidated a new regime. It wouldn't have saved the Republic, almost likely, very likely, but we could have seen just a perpetuation of the civil conflict that we saw before the rise of Julius Caesar. Octavius could have decided to back down, or he could have been assassinated very early, and all of history would have looked entirely different. So it's not just the fact that this boy inherited his position, rather, he decided to seize the legacy, not simply inherit the legacy.
Absolutely, that's a remarkable thing. I mean, really, sort of almost unbelievably remarkable. There's lots of times in history when someone very, very young has to step into the breach, and they're completely ineffective. And you can't really blame them, really, being a 50. I mean, William the Conqueror um, jumps to mind, being extremely young. You haven't got protectors who are completely on your side. Be very, very difficult. But Octavian seems to pick up the mantle completely on his own. So yeah, the idea that he inherits the name, so he becomes sort of paterfamilias, he become legally the head of that household. Well, good luck in the world in which he is existing in at that moment. But the thing I think is sort of even more interesting, or not more interesting, but the thing that's truly, truly remarkable is that he was able to convert it very quickly. You mentioned, like, there's a famous line from Cicero saying, "This boy is to be sort of placated for a while and then just swept aside. He can't be, it's just there's no way he can be a true player on this stage. It's just there's no way that's possible." But it was. So again, there's that idea of what forged him. So his all his childhood, really, I imagine, from when his first real memories kick in, when he's first sort of old enough to be aware of what's going on around him. I don't know when that was for you, but you can't be much younger than 7, 8, 9, 10 years old when you're able to really understand what's going on. Already at that point, the Catalan conspiracy is in the past. His great uncle is in Gaul doing that thing. And then when he's going through the years when he's old enough to sort of truly understand what's going on, when you're sort of 14, 15, 16, those are the years when Caesar's fighting Pompey and fighting all over the Roman world for supremacy, and then winning, and then ruling as a dictator, well, in the end, dictator for life. Those are the years when he's 15, 16, 17, 18, are those years. So he sees how it's done, or rather how it's not done. He could, what an education that is. Talk about being thrown in, baptism of fire, being thrown in the deep end, immediately being not involved politically, but being right next to the actor of the age, being right next to him. So there's a few things he did I think when he was 16, he went out to Spain and visited Caesar while Caesar was campaigning in Spain. I think
it was very traditional, wasn't
against one
it?
of
When
yeah,
you become a man, you
right,
effectively become a camp follower, and you're
right,
expected essentially to take up military responsibility alongside your relatives. But again, it's quite remarkable, isn't it, to become nothing more than a camp follower to the to be the driver of a legacy of the
right.
magnitude of Caesar within 3 years. And this is really what's startling. It's interesting that you brought up Cicero because you would have thought, based on what you just said, wouldn't you, about his entire sort of formative experience being left in the legacy of Caesar, either in the conquest of Gaul or the period of dictatorship from 49 until 44 BC, that a more primitive and you can say brutish character would have looked at that and said, "Oh, I just want to be Caesar. I just want to be the dictator. I want to assume power and I want everyone to submit to me." But part of the genius of Augustus is the fact that he, from a very early age, has a clear conception of his role within the grand scope of Roman history. It's something that Cicero, of course, is obsessed with in terms of understanding the past, in terms of understanding yourself. Of course, Caesar turned that into his great sort of political rallying cry to some extent, the importance of lineage. But of course, when it comes to Augustus, one of the first things he does is not simply go out as we imagine and take vengeance against the murders of his adopted father, Julius Caesar. But instead, he occupies this halfway house position where he actually goes after Mark Antony. He becomes the champion of the Roman elite and he panders almost excessively to Cicero. And so it's remarkable in the way that you bring up that famous quote. He is basically to be used as an ornament and then discarded.
Mm,
I
mm,
we can exploit the name, can't we? We understand that it may be very useful for our purposes to take the heir of Caesar and then use him as a weapon of the liberators, effectively, and then discard him should he actually begin to assume that Caesar would mean anything as a political tool in the long term. So that is very much Cicero's thinking. But it's very interesting that Augustus wants to appeal to both legacies early on at the beginning. He wants to appeal to the legacy of his father, and he wants to appeal to the legacy of the man who brought down the Catiline conspiracy. So to him, as we later see with maybe Mark Antony, in the same way that he's looking at acts of vengeance, he's also looking for new Catiline conspiracies, essentially. So at the
mm,
one hand, he's furthering the legacy of political consolidation of his father, yet he's also saving the Republic. Two themes which you would seem to be, mutually exclusive, but ultimately you can say they form part of the remarkable legacy of Augustus. It's only much later, a year or so later, that having essentially established this position, and you mentioned again remarkable thing about how he's able to achieve so much power so early. One of the many sort of facets of Augustus that allowed him to stay in power for so long was his um, copious generosity. It wasn't simply enough to hang on and receive the estates of Julius Caesar. You had to purchase loyalty. You had to purchase the legions. You had to outbid Mark Antony whenever you were appealing effectively to the loyalty of the same soldiers. And it was his willingness to use the estates of Julius Caesar as a political legacy, effectively, to invest that into buying the loyalty of his former legionnaires. That very early on makes him a necessity for people like Cicero, but then allows him to ally with people like Mark Antony and basically
mm,
go on and achieve the act of vengeance against the murderers of his adoptive father, the liberators. But of course, that means that's another contradiction because you have the legions, you have set up a power base. Now you understand that Cicero is not going to be a strong ally for you. You understand that you have, almost as an act of political necessity, to take the fight to Brutus and Cassius. And yet, on the
mm,
other hand, you have to pander, you can say, to the excessive brutality of someone like a Mark Antony who wants to go back into Rome and commit massive proscriptions. So Caesar,
mm,
rather than preventing the murder of all of these Roman elites, basically turns a blind eye and lets it happen again. So on the one hand, you can say he's trying to appeal to the legacy of clemency of Julius Caesar, yet also he has to open up and become this wrathful figure in terms of being able
Mm.
to allow him to continue down the path of power.
So a couple of quick things. One, you've mentioned Caesar as his father a couple of times there, but we already said that he's his great uncle. So a couple of things to mention, just to go back to that moment in time when Caesar's assassinated, and in his will is made clear that he's adopted, sort of formally adopted Octavian as his son and heir. So, so at that point, then Octavian can say, "My father was Julius Caesar, the divine Julius Caesar." They sort of deified Caesar after he
And
left.
of and
So
of course and of course, then it's not just that he is Caesar; he is son of a god as
right, so
well.
that's exactly what I was going to say. So Octavian goes through many different titles and names, many during his life. The last one is Augustus. But yeah, at that point he calls himself, what is it? Uh, uh, what is it? What is the Latin? Divi Felus or something.
Yes.
The son of a god, son of the divine Julius, basically. And so, if we could go back briefly to that moment in time, so he knows that he's very close to Caesar. Literally gone on campaign with him, and must have spent a fair amount of time, or at least a little bit of time in his company. And Caesar, Julius Caesar, obviously took a shine to him. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left what he did to him in his will. But yet, there is Caesarion in Egypt. There is that boy there by Cleopatra, um, and so again, it must have been obvious to say an unbelievable shock when Octavian hears that Uncle Julius, great Uncle Julius, has just been murdered. He doesn't necessarily know what the will is going to say. He might fear, at least for a moment or two, that his assassins are going to come after him, or the whole family, but they don't. So one, we've already said, it's absolutely remarkable that he was able to step up to the plate, to use parlance of our time, and start acting as a political player in his own right. But beyond that, to be able to not only have the guts or the balls to try, but then to play his hand very well. So in the first instance, to realise that he's got multiple enemies. Of course, there's the people that just murdered Caesar, so Brutus and others, but also to realise that Mark Antony, Octavian, is gonna have to have a power struggle for supremacy within the Caesarian camp, because Mark Antony obviously thinks of himself as the natural, not sort of legal heir, but the natural successor to Caesar when it comes to, legions, and or just being ahead of that faction from now on. So he's got Octavian has got two completely separate uh, factions that he will have to fight against if he is to win ultimately. And so there's two things. One, just the nous, the guts to even try to do this, and then secondly, a political acumen. Like, where does this 18, 19-year-old kid get a political acumen to realise, okay, I will exploit the name of Caesar. I'll start calling myself the son of a god. Right, okay, do that. I have to go through the legal battles of actually getting the money, to actually do it. And when I do, to pay off the lead. Again, the political acumen or the political ability to realise, to see with sort of a laser-like focus, I've got to pay the legions. I can't just take that for myself or squander it or do other things with it. The legions are absolutely important. Again, to play Cicero like a fiddle, really. Oh, you think you're going to manipulate me? No, I'm manipulating you, if anything. Um, and then again, to have the political ability to realise that very quickly or almost straight away, to call out the murderers and say, I'm not going to have that. Not straight away, but fairly quickly, to say that that's a line in the sand that needs to be dealt with, because he's gets himself created consul very quickly. Is it within a year or is it 2 years? before he winds up as he's sort of manipulated events so that he can be consul completely illegally. He's not old enough. He hasn't gone through the Cursus Honorum remotely. So anyway, I just think there's two things that are absolutely remarkable. One, to have the balls to even try this, and two, to have the political ability to not immediately fail. Right, and he's got people around him like Maecenas and Agrippa, but they're about his age. They're not much older or anything. How he wasn't murdered by somebody in the first year or two is incredible, right?
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.